May 13, 1945. The morning sun burned through the mist over Hollandia, a muddy American base on the northern coast of Dutch New Guinea. Inside a C-47 transport plane called the Gremlin Special, 24 passengers and crew settled in for what they thought would be a pleasure flight. Colonel Peter Prosson was at the controls. He had invited his staff to see a legendary hidden valley the pilots called Shangri-La. Among those aboard were Corporal Margaret Hastings, a WAC secretary eager for her first glimpse of the mysterious valley. Also on board were twin brothers, Lieutenant John McCullum and Lieutenant Robert McCullum, who rarely went anywhere without each other. They reached the valley in the early afternoon. From the air, Shangri-La was a paradise of green terraces and winding rivers, ringed by sheer mountain walls. Prosson dropped low for a better view. The plane skimmed the treetops at barely 400 feet. Then, without warning, a sudden downdraft slammed the C-47 downward. The left wing clipped the trees. The plane tore through the jungle canopy, shedding wings and engine cowlings. The fuselage broke apart, cartwheeling through the underbrush before coming to rest in a heap of twisted metal. Fire erupted instantly, consuming the wreckage. Of the 24 souls who had boarded that morning, only 3 crawled out alive: Margaret Hastings, John McCullum, and Tech Sergeant Ken Decker. They were burned, bleeding, and utterly alone. The crash of the Gremlin Special had stranded 3 survivors in the heart of an uncharted wilderness, miles from any help, with no way to call for rescue. How would they survive? How would anyone even find them? The answer would test their will to live against the jungle, their injuries, and the long ticking clock of hope. For the next 2 days, the 3 survivors did not wait to die. They took stock of their shattered world. Margaret Hastings could barely walk. Her legs were badly burned, and the skin was already turning black. Ken Decker had a deep gash across his forehead, blood still seeping through a crude bandage. John McCullum, though injured, moved with a grim purpose. He dragged himself back into the burning wreckage to salvage what he could: a few cans of water, some cellophane-wrapped charms candies, a knife, a signal mirror. They had to leave the dead where they lay. The living could barely move themselves. John McCullum carried the knowledge that his brother Robert was among the unrecovered bodies. John said nothing, but the loss sat heavy on his shoulders. They gathered their meager supplies and followed a stream downhill, hoping it would lead them to open ground. The jungle fought them at every step. Thorns tore at their burned skin. Leeches fastened onto their wounds. Margaret crawled on her hands and knees when she could no longer stand. Decker stumbled along, his head pounding with fever. On the second day, they found a small clearing on a knoll near a river. It was not much, but it was flat and open enough to be seen from the air. They set up camp there, using scraps of parachute and wreckage to build a crude shelter. Their food was nearly gone. They drank rainwater collected in a tin can and shared the few charms candies one by one. The injuries worsened. Decker's wound grew infected. Margaret's leg burns turned gangrenous, the flesh rotting and stinking. They had no medicine, no bandages, no hope of rescue except for one thing. John McCullum had salvaged a small signal mirror from the wreck. Each day, when the sun broke through the clouds, he stood on the knoll and flashed it at the sky. Hour after hour, he swept the mirror across the horizon, looking for any plane that might pass. They also planted a handkerchief on a stick, waving it whenever they heard an engine. But the days passed, and the sky remained empty. The jungle closed in around them, and the silence was broken only by the sound of their own labored breathing. May 15 brought a sound the survivors had prayed for: the drone of aircraft engines. A B-17 Flying Fortress appeared over the ridge, and John McCullum grabbed the signal mirror, flashing frantically at the sky. The pilot, Captain William Baker, spotted the clearing and the tiny figures waving below. He banked hard and dropped his altitude for a closer look. Baker circled back and kicked out supply bundles, food cans, medical kits, and a walkie-talkie wrapped in parachute cloth. The survivors scrambled to gather the packages as they tumbled through the trees. McCullum switched on the radio and heard a human voice, the first contact with the outside world since the crash. Baker reported their coordinates, and a rescue operation began taking shape back at Hollandia. On May 18th, Hastings heard a noise that was not an engine. It was the trilling chatter of human voices. A column of Dani warriors emerged from the jungle, led by a wiry, confident man named Wimayuk Wandik. They carried spears and bows, but their faces held curiosity, not aggression. Wandik stepped forward with open hands. McCollum met him halfway, and the two men clasped hands in a gesture that transcended language. Wandick led his men to a sweet potato garden nearby and began digging up the vegetables, offering them to the bewildered survivors. This peaceful encounter was not the first time outsiders had touched this valley. 7 years earlier, in 1938, the American explorer Richard Archbold had flown over these same peaks in his seaplane, the Guba. He spotted the Grand Valley, a vast, populated basin never before seen by the Western world. Archbold's expedition landed on a nearby lake and made tentative contact with the Dani people. They found a thriving population of farmers and warriors living in a polished Stone Age culture. But Archbold did not stay, and the valley returned to its isolation until the Gremlin Special fell from the sky and brought the world back to their door. By May 18th, Hastings could not hide the truth any longer. The burns on her legs had turned black and foul-smelling. Gangrene was consuming the flesh. Decker's forehead wound oozed infection, and his fever climbed. The sweet potatoes and the charms candies were nearly gone. That afternoon, the walkie-talkie crackled with news. 2 medics would parachute into the jungle to reach them. Back in Hollandia, Captain Earl Walter of the 1st Reconnaissance Battalion assembled his men. He gave them the facts. No maps of the drop zone, no guarantee the natives were friendly, and no plan for getting out. Every single paratrooper stepped forward. Walter selected 10, including 2 medics, both experienced Filipino-American soldiers who understood the risks. The mission to Shangri-La was underway. C-47 banked low over the jungle clearing on the morning of May 19th. Captain Walter stood in the open door and watched Sergeant Bulatao and Corporal Ramirez check their equipment one last time. The plane dropped to just a few hundred feet above the jagged terrain, and the 2 medics leaped into the void. Wind caught them immediately, spinning their parachutes far off course. Ramirez came down hard on a rocky outcrop, twisting his left ankle badly. Bulatao landed safely nearby in the brush. Dani guides materialized from the trees and led the limping medics through the jungle toward the survivors' camp. When Hastings saw the 2 figures approaching, she burst into tears and hugged them both. Ramirez smiled broadly, his 2 gold front teeth flashing in the dim light. Bulatao knelt beside her without a word and began examining the blackened flesh on her legs. He poured peroxide into the wounds and dusted them with sulfanilamide powder. The medics worked the same grim routine on Decker, cutting away dead skin from his infected burns. For the first time since the crash, the survivors had real medical care. The following morning, May 20th, Captain Walter and 9 paratroopers jumped from a C-47 into the main valley of Shangri-La. They landed in a flat expanse of kunai grass near a place the natives called Wosi. Before the last parachute touched ground, more than 200 Dani warriors surrounded them, armed with spears and bows. Walter held his carbine low and ordered his men to hold their fire. For 3 hours, neither side moved. Walter tried a desperate gesture to break the standoff. He unbuckled his belt, dropped his trousers, and showed the warriors he was a man, not a woman in uniform. The Dani men burst out laughing at the sight. The tension broke instantly. Soon the paratroopers were shaking hands with their new neighbors, and a base camp took shape near the village of Kolowima. Walter noted in his journal that night that the natives seemed healthy and curious, though they never bathed. Over the next 2 weeks, camp life settled into a strange daily rhythm. Supply planes dropped food and mail while reporters broadcast the story over their radios. Hastings, still weak from her burns, bathed each morning in a helmet of warm water while Dani onlookers watched with open fascination. She waved them away at first, but they only smiled and stayed until she finished. One of the native women from the village, whom Margaret called the Queen, drew close to her with quiet curiosity. She offered Margaret a sweet potato, and the gesture became the start of a friendship that crossed every barrier of language and culture. Margaret treasured this bond for the rest of her time in the valley. The paratroopers traded cowrie shells for pigs and stone axes, building a stockade for their new livestock. They named a runt piglet Peggy in Hastings' honor and scrubbed it clean every day until it shone. But darker work lay ahead. Walter and his men began scouting the mountain slope above camp, searching for the burned wreck of the Gremlin Special. They needed to find the dead and give them a proper burial with crosses and dog tags. On June 6th, Walter's team finally located the crash site high on the Ogi Ridge. The wreckage was a burned, twisted ruin, scarcely recognizable as an airplane. The heat of the fire had cremated most of the bodies beyond recognition. The men dug 3 individual graves for those who could be identified and 1 common grave for the remaining 18. They wore gas masks against the stench as they worked through the afternoon. As the paratroopers pounded white crosses and a single Star of David into the damp earth, a plane circled overhead carrying 2 chaplains. Their voices crackled over a walkie-talkie down to the camp where the 3 survivors sat listening. McCullum stared at the ground, his jaw tight, his twin brother Robert buried somewhere in that common grave. The service ended with the lonely notes of taps drifting through the mountain mist. Hastings wrote that her heart ached for him. It was June 18, 1945, and the camp in Shangri-La had settled into a strange routine of medical care and card games when a new type of visitor appeared in the sky. A former Hollywood actor turned war correspondent named Alexander Can had hitched a ride on a supply plane. Can had survived a torpedo attack and a kamikaze strike, and he wanted to film the story of the survivors. He had never made a parachute jump in his life. Before the jump, Can drank a full 5th of Dutch gin to steel his nerves. "I didn't want to hesitate," he later explained. He lurched through the jump door and swung wildly under his canopy, his body limp and unresponsive. Below, the paratroopers shouted for him to pull his legs together. He landed flat on his back in a clump of bushes, still drunk but completely unhurt. The first man to reach Can was one of the paratroopers. "This man is drunk," he called out. John McCullum arrived moments later and confirmed the diagnosis. Drunker than a hoot owl. But Can sobered up quickly, pulled out his camera, and began filming. Within hours he was eating chow mein with the rescue party, joking with Captain Walter, and telling wild stories of his Hollywood days. By mid-June, news of the crash and the rescue effort had exploded across the United States. Reporters Walter Simmons of the Chicago Tribune and Ralph Morton of the Associated Press filed stories from the supply planes that flew over the camp daily. They interviewed the survivors by walkie-talkie, and their dispatches made front pages around the world. Margaret Hastings became the Queen of Shangri-La, and her polite request for a change of underwear was turned into a national joke. Back in Hollandia, planners led by Colonel Ray Elsmore faced an urgent problem: how to get everyone out of the valley. A helicopter could not fly over the mountains. A land trek would take weeks through headhunter territory. The only option that made sense was a glider. They would use a Waco CG-4A, a plywood and canvas aircraft that could land on rough ground and be snatched back into the air by a tow plane. The plan was risky. The valley sat a mile above sea level, and the surrounding ridges rose to 10,000 feet. No glider had ever been snatched at such an altitude with passengers aboard. The pilots would have to land, load up, and then wait for a C-47 to hook them off the ground. One mistake could turn the glider into a pile of splinters and kill everyone inside. To test the equipment, the crew set up a training base on WAC Island, a small strip of land off the coast of Hollandia. The proposed snatch pilot, Major William Samuels, flew his borrowed C-47, nicknamed Leaking Louise, to the island. Glider pilot Lieutenant Henry Palmer brought his Waco glider, called the Fanless Faggot. They began practice runs at sea level before attempting the high-altitude extraction. The first tests failed. Samuels came in too low, and the steel hook missed the nylon loop. On a second attempt, the tow cable snapped and destroyed the winch. Then, during a third trial, the cable broke again just after the snatch. The broken line whipped through the cabin, slashing the winch operator across the head and cutting the radio operator across the back. Both men were hospitalized. Colonel Elsmore flew to WAC Island himself. He sat in the glider's co-pilot seat for the next 3 test runs, which went off without a hitch. The training was complete. Despite the injuries and the scare, Elsmore gave the order. The glider snatch was on. The first flight would land in Shangri-La on the morning of June 28th. That morning, the Fanless Faggot was towed into the valley by a C-46. Palmer released the tow cable and glided the engineless Waco down to the makeshift runway of cut brush and kunai grass. The landing was perfect. As the glider rolled to a stop, the survivors and medic Sergeant Bouleteau and another sergeant climbed aboard. Margaret Hastings clutched her rosary. Palmer gave them a grim warning. Don't be surprised if the tow rope breaks on the first try. Major Samuels brought the Leaking Louise down to 20 feet above the valley floor. The steel hook caught the nylon loop, and the glider was yanked into the air. But the left wheel snagged a parachute marker, and the white cloth tore through the canvas floor. Hastings stared through the growing hole at the jungle thousands of feet below. The engines of the C-47 began to overheat as Samuels fought for altitude. The glider trailed 1,000 feet behind the tow plane. The nylon rope dragged through the treetops, pulling the glider through the upper branches. Inside, McCullum unbuckled his seatbelt, crawled to the tail, and pulled the shredded parachute cloth inside to keep it from ripping the floor open further. Samuels strained to clear the last ridge. The engine screamed, but they made it. 90 minutes later, they landed safely in Hollandia. 2 more glider snatches followed. On June 29th, Can, another paratrooper, and several others flew out. On July 1st, Captain Walter and his last 3 sergeants boarded the final glider. Walter carried a runt piglet named Peggy that the paratroopers had adopted as a camp mascot. The little pig squealed all the way out of the valley. As the last glider lifted off, the Dani warriors who had gathered to watch stood silent. Some of them wept. They knew they were losing friends. The people of Uwambo held a crying ceremony to mourn the departure of the sky spirits. They had given the visitors safe passage through their battlefields, and now they were gone. The valley fell quiet. Back at the abandoned camp, the natives gathered the food the soldiers had left behind and placed it in a cave. They sprinkled pig blood over it in a purification ceremony. The spirits had returned to the sky just as the old legend had foretold, but the valley would never be the same. The outside world was only a flight away now, and it was coming. In the summer of 1945, the 3 survivors returned to the United States as celebrities. Margaret Hastings stepped off a train in Owego, New York, to find 3,000 people cheering. The local band played a march, and the Chamber of Commerce declared her Owego's #1 citizen. She toured the country for war bonds, giving more than 200 speeches, posing with generals, and receiving marriage proposals from strangers. But she never considered herself a hero, only a fortunate survivor. Within a year, movie offers faded, and she quietly enrolled at Syracuse University, seeking the anonymity she had lost in the jungle. Captain Earl Walter received the Soldier's Medal and called Shangri-La the highlight of his life. Medics Ben Bulatao and Camilo Ramirez died in 1985 and 2005 respectively. Alexander Can returned to Australia, sobered up, and returned to acting before his death in 1977. Reporter Walter Simmons continued as a foreign correspondent and died in 2006. Ralph Morton remained with the Associated Press and died in 1988. Glider pilot Henry Palmer returned to Louisiana, married, and died in 1991. Explorer Richard Archbold never returned to New Guinea and died in 1976, leaving his fortune to conservation, high in the mountains. The machete McCullum gave to Wimayuk Wandik remained in his family for decades, a silent reminder of the day spirits fell from the sky. The valley that the world called Shangri-La did not remain hidden for long. Missionaries arrived, then Indonesian troops, then paved roads and airstrips. The perpetual wars of the Dani people ended, but so did much of their ancient way of life today. Old men in penis gourds walk the dusty streets of Wamena, selling photographs of themselves for a few coins. Yet on a clear morning, when the mist lifts from the Ogi Ridge, the mountains look exactly as they did on May 13, 1945, indifferent, beautiful, and eternal. If you have family stories, letters, or photographs from the Pacific Theater in World War II, we would be honored to hear about them in the comments below. We read each one. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to help us tell more stories like this, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. Thank you sincerely for listening and for keeping these histories alive.